In a cramped farmhouse outside Mound City, Missouri, where the summer heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, and the only relief came from the occasional freight train rattling through the darkness, a child was born who would grow up to become one of America's most invisible killers, July 16th, 1929. The baby didn't cry much, they said. Even then, Charles Ray Hatcher was learning to stay quiet. His father, Jesse, was the kind of man who solved problems with his fists and drowned his guilt in whiskey. An ex-convict with dead eyes and calloused knuckles, he ruled their household through fear and violence. Charles's mother, Lula, already worn thin by 3 older sons and a husband who saw family as property to be controlled, had little left to give her youngest child. Love was a luxury the Hatcher family couldn't afford. Charles learned early that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who hurt others and those who got hurt. By age 6, he'd figured out which side he wanted to be on. At school, he was relentlessly bullied by older children who sensed his weakness like wolves smelling blood. But Charles didn't just endure it. He studied it. He memorized the way fear looked in someone's eyes, the exact moment when resistance turned to submission. Then he practiced what he'd learned on anyone smaller than himself. Teachers whispered about the strange boy who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain, but in Depression-era Missouri, troubled children were problems to be ignored, not solved. Charles was already becoming what he would remain for the rest of his life, invisible. Then came the day everything changed. Spring 1935. Charles and his older brothers were flying a kite they'd made with copper wire, salvaged from an old Model T Ford. The afternoon was perfect, with just enough wind to keep their makeshift toy dancing against the gray sky. Arthur Allen, his eldest brother, was about to hand the kite to Charles when the wire hit a high-voltage power line. Electricity coursed through Arthur's body in an instant. Charles watched his brother convulse and die, the smell of burned flesh filling the air. Arthur was pronounced dead at the scene, but something else died that day too. Whatever small capacity for normal human connection Charles might have possessed was severed as cleanly as if that power line had run through his own heart. Jesse Hatcher couldn't handle the death of his firstborn. Within months, he abandoned the family entirely, leaving behind only unpaid bills and the lingering stench of alcohol and failure. Lula remarried quickly, desperately, again and again. Charles found himself shuttled between stepfathers who saw him as nothing more than an unwanted burden, a reminder of his mother's complicated past. By the time Charles was 17, something had crystallized inside him. He didn't just feel invisible anymore, he was invisible. Teachers forgot his name, neighbors never saw him coming or going, and people looked right through him as if he didn't exist. This invisibility became his greatest weapon. In 1947, 18-year-old Charles committed his first recorded crime, stealing a logging truck from the Iowa-Missouri Walnut Company, where he'd worked for exactly 2 weeks. He received a suspended sentence, a slap on the wrist that taught him the system was even softer than he'd hoped. The next year, he stole a 1937 Buick and earned his first real prison sentence, 2 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Prison should have been a deterrent. Instead, it became Charles's graduate school in violence. Released in June 1949, after serving just over a year, he was back within months for forging a $10 check. The cycle had begun: crime, capture, imprisonment, release, repeat. Each time, Charles grew bolder, more sophisticated, more dangerous. But Charles wasn't satisfied with petty theft anymore. He was learning that he had an appetite for something darker. In June 1959, he attempted to abduct 16-year-old Stephen Pelham, a newspaper delivery boy in St. Joseph. The teenager fought back and reported the crime, and Charles was arrested while driving yet another stolen vehicle. This time, authorities charged him under the Habitual Criminal Act and sentenced him to 5 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Charles arrived at the penitentiary with a swagger, boasting to anyone who would listen that he was the most notorious criminal in Northwest Missouri since Jesse James. It was a laughable claim from a petty car thief, but Charles believed his own mythology. He was about to make it real. On July 2nd, 1961, 26-year-old inmate Jerry Tharrington was found raped and stabbed to death on the prison kitchen loading dock. His body had been repeatedly pierced, the wounds suggesting both rage and calculation. Charles was the only member of the kitchen crew unaccounted for at the time of the murder. While there wasn't enough evidence for a conviction, everyone knew who had crossed the line from petty criminal to killer. In solitary confinement, Charles wrote a note claiming he needed psychiatric treatment. The prison psychologist dismissed it as manipulation, a scheme to escape or reduce his sentence. Treatment was refused, and Charles returned to the general population with his sentence reduced for good behavior. On August 24th, 1963, the man who had almost certainly committed his first murder walked free. What followed was a pattern of violence so systematic it seemed choreographed by evil itself. Charles had discovered his true calling, and children were his preferred victims. On August 27th, 1969, he would later confess to abducting 12-year-old William Freeman in Antioch, California. Charles claimed he lured the boy away, took him to a creek, and strangled him. The body was never found. 2 days later, 6-year-old Gilbert Martinez vanished in San Francisco. A witness saw the boy walking away with a man who had offered him ice cream. Gilbert was found being beaten and sexually assaulted by a stranger, a man who matched Charles's description perfectly. But Charles was already gone, disappeared into the vast anonymity of America's highways. Throughout the 1970s, Charles became a ghost, drifting from state to state under multiple aliases. He used names like Albert Ralph Price, Richard Lee Grady, and Richard Clark, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. His crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality, but the scattered jurisdictions never connected the dots. Charles had learned to exploit the cracks in the system, the spaces between police departments where monsters could hide. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. Charles would identify vulnerable children, usually boys between the ages of 4 and 12. He'd approach them with offers of food, money, or help, preying on their innocence and trust. Once he had them isolated, the nightmare would begin. Sexual assault was followed by murder, and the bodies were disposed of with clinical efficiency. Charles's ability to remain undetected was terrifying. He wasn't the charismatic psychopath who charmed his way to victims. He was forgettable, ordinary, the kind of man who could disappear in a crowd of 2. This ordinariness was his camouflage, allowing him to move freely through society while leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. On May 26, 1978, 4-year-old Eric Christian disappeared from downtown St. Joseph, Missouri. The boy had been playing near the Missouri River when he vanished without a trace. Weeks later, his body was discovered along the riverbank, bearing signs of sexual assault and suffocation. The investigation was thorough, but fruitless. Over 100 suspects were questioned, including what police called every known pervert in town. Among those questioned was Melvin Reynolds, a 25-year-old man with limited intelligence who had suffered his own childhood sexual abuse. Reynolds was agitated by the intense questioning, but cooperated fully, submitting to polygraph tests and even hypnotic interrogation. Under pressure, his answers became confused and contradictory. In the weeks that followed, investigators fed Reynolds details about the crime, whether deliberately or inadvertently. His fragmented recollections began to coalesce into what sounded like a confession. A jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and Reynolds was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Meanwhile, Charles continued his killing spree, invisible and untouchable. He bounced between mental health facilities and halfway houses, his obvious dangerousness somehow overlooked by every professional who encountered him. The system that should have protected society from Charles Hatcher instead enabled him. Each arrest was followed by release. Each psychiatric evaluation dismissed his obvious threat, and each jurisdiction assumed someone else would handle the problem. Charles had become what he'd always been destined to be, a monster hiding in plain sight. He understood that his unremarkable appearance was his greatest asset. He looked like everyone's harmless uncle, the quiet man who fixed things and kept to himself. This facade allowed him to continue killing while authorities chased shadows and the wrong men went to prison for his crimes. By the early 1980s, Charles had perfected his methods. He would approach potential victims with a combination of false kindness and manufactured vulnerability. Children trusted him because he seemed safe, non-threatening, even pathetic. Their parents barely noticed him. He was the gray man, the forgettable figure who could walk into a child's life and walk out again, leaving only absence and grief behind. On July 29, 1982, 11-year-old Michelle Steele was reported missing from St. Joseph. Her disappearance sparked an immediate manhunt, with police and volunteers searching every inch of the area. The next day, Michelle's uncle discovered her nude body on the banks of the Missouri River. She had been beaten and strangled to death, her small body bearing evidence of the same brutal treatment that had killed Eric Christgen 4 years earlier. This time, police had a suspect. Charles was arrested the following day as he attempted to check himself into the St. Joseph State Hospital, perhaps finally recognizing the depth of his own madness. But Charles wasn't mad in any clinical sense. He was simply evil in its purest form. While awaiting trial, Charles did something that shocked even hardened investigators. He confessed not just to Michelle's murder, but to 15 other killings spanning 13 years. He drew crude maps showing where bodies were buried, provided details that only the killer could know, and spoke about his crimes with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Among his revelations was the truth about Eric Christgen's murder, the crime for which Melvin Reynolds had spent 4 years in prison. Charles described the killing in vivid detail, explaining how he had lured the 4-year-old away and murdered him. Reynolds was immediately released, but the damage to his life was irreversible. Charles also led investigators to the remains of James Churchill, a 28-year-old man buried in the rocky soil near the Rock Island Army Arsenal in Iowa. The map Charles drew was so accurate that searchers found the body within hours. It was another victim no one had connected to the drifter who killed without pattern or reason. In October 1983, Charles was convicted of Eric Christian's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 50 years. The following year, he faced a trial for Michelle Steele's murder. In a final act of defiance or perhaps self-awareness, Charles requested the death penalty. The jury refused, recommending life imprisonment instead. On December 3, 1984, Charles received his second life sentence. 4 days later, guards found him hanging in his cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. He had used bed sheets to fashion a noose, ending his life at age 55. Some claimed it was impossible for him to have tied his hands behind his back as they appeared to be, but no investigation was launched. Charles Ray Hatcher was dead, and that was enough. The true extent of Charles's crimes may never be known. He confessed to 16 murders, but was likely responsible for many more. His nomadic lifestyle, use of multiple aliases, and the jurisdictional confusion of the 1970s created the perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. What made Charles Hatcher truly terrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was his ordinariness. He wasn't the brilliant psychopath of popular fiction or the charismatic manipulator who charmed his way to victims. He was invisible, forgettable, the kind of man you'd never notice in a crowd, and that invisibility allowed him to prey on the most vulnerable members of society for over 2 decades. His story serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it wears the face of the man next door, the quiet loner who never quite fits in but never quite stands out either. Charles Ray Hatcher proved that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we never see coming, the ones who kill not because they've lost control, but because they've chosen to embrace the darkness that lives inside us all. On a cold October night in 1973, the sidewalks of San Francisco transformed into hunting grounds. A young couple, Richard and Quita Haig, took what they thought would be a romantic evening stroll near Coit Tower. They never made it home. What happened to them that night would mark the beginning of one of the most terrifying and racially motivated killing sprees in American history, orchestrated by a group calling themselves the Death Angels. Among them was a 23-year-old man named Manuel Moore, whose name has largely faded from public memory despite being one of the most methodical and remorseless killers of the 1970s. Unlike the headline-grabbing serial killers we know today, Moore operated in the shadows, his crimes overshadowed by more sensational cases. But what he and his accomplices did to San Francisco was nothing short of psychological warfare against an entire city. This is the story of a man who believed murder was a holy act, who turned the streets of one of America's most liberal cities into a battlefield, and whose reign of terror would forever change how we think about hate crimes in America. Manuel Moore was born in 1947, though little is known about his early childhood. What we do know is that by his early 20s, he had already been in and out of the criminal justice system. In 1969, he was convicted of burglary and sent to San Quentin State Prison. It was behind those walls that Moore would undergo a transformation that would turn him into something far more dangerous than a petty criminal. Prison can break a man or forge him into something harder. For Moore, it was the latter. At San Quentin, he encountered the radical teachings of a splinter group within the Nation of Islam. This wasn't the mainstream Muslim faith, but a twisted interpretation that preached that white people were devils who needed to be eliminated from the earth. The ideology filled a void in Moore's life, giving him a sense of purpose and belonging he had never known. It was also in prison that Moore met the men who would become his partners in murder: Anthony Harris, Jesse Lee Cooks, Larry Green, and JCX Simon. Together, they formed what they called the Death Angels, a group dedicated to earning their wings through what they saw as the holy act of killing white people. According to their beliefs, each member needed to kill a certain number of white victims to achieve a higher status within their twisted hierarchy. When Moore was released from prison in 1973, he carried with him more than just hatred. He carried a mission. The Death Angels operated out of a black self-help warehouse in San Francisco's Fillmore district. To the outside world, it appeared to be a legitimate community organization, but in the back rooms and basements, Moore and his accomplices planned what they called their holy war. They studied the city's streets, identified vulnerable targets, and prepared for what would become known as the Zebra Murders. The name came from the police radio band assigned to the case, but it could just as easily have described the black and white nature of the crimes. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. They were calculated, methodical executions carried out with religious fervor. October 20th, 1973, marked the beginning of the terror. Richard and Quita Haig were walking near Coit Tower when they were forced into a white van at gunpoint. What happened next was so brutal that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the scene. Quita was sexually assaulted, then nearly decapitated with a machete. The blade cut so deep that it severed her spinal cord and jugular vein. Richard was also attacked with the machete, but somehow survived, becoming the first witness to the Death Angels' methodology. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, Moore and his accomplices would transform San Francisco into a city under siege. The killings followed a pattern that spoke to Moore's calculating nature. The victims were chosen not for who they were, but for what they represented. White skin was their only crime. The Death Angels would cruise the city streets, particularly along the Divisadero corridor, looking for isolated targets. When they found them, they struck with terrifying efficiency. December 11th, 1973. Paul Dansick, a 26-year-old art student, was walking down Haight Street when Moore approached him. Without warning, without provocation, Moore pulled out a .32 caliber pistol and shot Dansick 3 times. The young man died on the sidewalk, his blood mixing with the rain that had started to fall. Moore walked away as casually as if he had just finished a conversation. January 28th was 1974 would become known as the bloodiest day of the Zebra Murders. Moore and JCX Simon drove through the city on what they called a hunting expedition. In the span of a few hours, they killed 4 people and paralyzed a 5th. Tana Smith, a 32-year-old mother, was shot dead while walking to her car. Vincent Wallen, 69 years old, was gunned down while waiting for a bus. John Bambick, 84, was shot and killed outside his apartment building. Jane Hawley, 45, was murdered while carrying groceries. Roxanne McMillan, 23, was shot in the spine and paralyzed for life as she retrieved clothes from her car. To Moore and Simon, this wasn't a crime spree. It was poetry in motion, a symphony of violence that they believed was blessed by their twisted interpretation of God. What made Moore particularly terrifying wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his complete lack of remorse. Witnesses who encountered him described a man who seemed almost bored by violence, as if taking a life was no more significant than swatting a fly. He didn't kill in fits of rage or passion. He killed with the methodical precision of someone performing a routine task. The psychological profile that emerged during his trial painted a picture of a man who had successfully divorced himself from human empathy. Psychiatrists who examined Moore found him to be highly intelligent, but completely without conscience. He understood right from wrong in an intellectual sense, but those concepts held no emotional weight for him. To Moore, the suffering of his victims was irrelevant. What mattered was the mission, or the ideology, the twisted sense of purpose that gave his life meaning. As the body count rose, San Francisco descended into panic. The randomness of the attacks meant that no one was safe. White residents began avoiding certain neighborhoods entirely. Businesses closed early. The city that prided itself on tolerance and diversity was suddenly divided along the starkest possible lines. Mayor Joseph Alioto, desperate to restore order, authorized one of the most controversial police operations in the city's history. Operation Zebra gave officers permission to stop and question any black male who fit the general description of the killers. It was racial profiling on a massive scale, and it tore at the social fabric of the city. Hundreds of innocent men were stopped, questioned, and humiliated. The operation was eventually ruled unconstitutional, but not before it had deepened the very racial divisions that Moore and his accomplices sought to exploit. The breakthrough in the case came not from police work, but from betrayal within the Death Angel's own ranks. Anthony Harris, who had participated in some of the attacks but claimed to have never pulled the trigger himself, began to fear for his own life. He believed that Moore and the others were planning to kill him to keep him quiet. Faced with that possibility, Harris made a decision that would bring down the entire organization. On April 28, 1974, Harris walked into San Francisco City Hall and told Mayor Alioto that he had information about the zebra killings. In exchange for immunity and protection, he was willing to reveal everything. The mayor, desperate for any break in the case, agreed to meet with him. What Harris told them was even more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The Death Angels weren't just responsible for the known zebra murders. They had been killing people throughout California for years, possibly decades. Harris claimed that the group had a network of cells operating up and down the West Coast, each one dedicated to the systematic murder of white people. He provided names, locations, methods, and motives that had never been connected to the official investigation. Based on Harris's information, police raided the Black Self-Help warehouse at 844 Grove Street on May 1st, 1974. They arrested 7 men, though only 4 would ultimately be charged with murder. Moore was among them, and when they searched his belongings, they found a chilling collection of evidence. Moore had kept detailed records of the killings, not trophies in the traditional sense, but notes and sketches that suggested he viewed the murders as a form of religious documentation. He had drawn maps of the city with victim locations marked. He had written what appeared to be prayers or incantations related to the killings. Most disturbing of all, he had compiled a list of potential future targets, complete with their daily routines and vulnerability assessments. When confronted with this evidence, Moore showed no emotion whatsoever. He didn't deny his involvement, but he also refused to express any remorse. To him, the investigators were representatives of the very system he had been trying to destroy. Their laws, their moral judgments, their horror at what he had done, all of it was irrelevant to a man who believed he was following a higher calling. The trial of the Zebra Killers began in March 1975 and would become the longest criminal trial in California history at that time. It lasted over a year, involved 212 days in court, and featured testimony from 181 witnesses. Throughout it all, Moore maintained an eerie calm that unnerved everyone in the courtroom. Anthony Harris's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Over the course of several days, he detailed not just the specific murders that had terrorized San Francisco, but the entire ideology and structure of the Death Angels. He described how Moore and the others had recruited new members, trained them in killing techniques, and indoctrinated them into believing that murder was a religious duty. According to Harris, Moore was one of the most dedicated members of the group. While others sometimes showed hesitation or doubt, Moore embraced the mission completely. He volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, showed initiative in identifying targets, and never questioned the morality of what they were doing. The prosecution painted Moore as a cold-blooded killer who had turned murder into a systematic campaign of terrorism. The defense tried to discredit Harris's testimony, pointing out that he had his own reasons for cooperating with authorities and that his version of events couldn't always be corroborated. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the patterns of violence were too consistent to ignore. On March 13, 1976, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Manuel Moore was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the guilty verdict was read, Moore showed no reaction. He didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't plead for mercy. He simply stood there, as calm and emotionless as he had been throughout the trial. When given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, he declined. To the very end, he remained a cipher, a man whose inner world was as alien and incomprehensible as the crimes he had committed. But the story of Manuel Moore doesn't end with his conviction. Behind bars, he continued to be a figure of fascination and fear for both fellow inmates and prison officials. Unlike many killers who either break down or find religion, Moore remained consistent in his beliefs. He never recanted his actions, never expressed remorse, and never sought forgiveness. Over the years, Moore came up for parole hearings multiple times. Each time, he faced panels of officials who struggled to understand how to evaluate a man who showed no signs of rehabilitation because he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Moore would sit calmly through these hearings, answering questions with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. When asked if he felt sorry for his victims, Moore would respond that he felt sorry for their family's loss, but not for the victims themselves. When asked if he would kill again if released, he would say that would depend on the circumstances and his religious beliefs at the time. These weren't the answers of a man seeking freedom through deception. They were the honest responses of someone who remained fundamentally unchanged by decades of imprisonment. Psychologists who studied Moore during his incarceration found him to be one of the most disturbing subjects they had ever encountered. It wasn't that he was insane in any clinical sense. His thought processes were logical, his memory was excellent, and he understood cause and effect perfectly well. What made him so unsettling was his complete inability to empathize with human suffering that fell outside his narrow definition of acceptable targets. One psychiatrist noted that Moore could express genuine concern for the welfare of animals or even for white prisoners who had treated him kindly, but when it came to his victims, he remained as cold as ice. It was as if his capacity for empathy had been surgically removed, leaving behind a functioning human being who was missing some essential component of humanity. The zebra murders had a lasting impact on San Francisco that extended far beyond the immediate terror they caused. The crimes shattered the city's self-image as a beacon of tolerance and racial harmony. They demonstrated how quickly fear could override progressive ideals when residents felt their lives were at stake. The controversial police response created deep divisions that took years to heal. But perhaps most significantly, the zebra murders served as an early warning about the dangers of extremist ideologies that dehumanize entire groups of people. Moore and his accomplices weren't mentally ill street criminals acting on impulse. They were intelligent, organized individuals who had been radicalized into believing that mass murder was a form of religious expression. In many ways, the Death Angels were precursors to the domestic terrorist cells that would emerge in later decades. They showed how fringe interpretations of legitimate movements could be twisted into justifications for unspeakable violence. They demonstrated that hatred, when given a pseudo-intellectual framework, could drive otherwise rational people to commit acts of stunning brutality. Manuel Moore died in prison on November 15, 2017, at the age of 73. He had served 43 years behind bars, longer than many serial killers and mass murderers. Even in death, he remained unrepentant. Prison officials who spoke off the record described him as one of the most chilling inmates they had ever encountered, not because he was violent or disruptive, but because of his absolute certainty that he had done nothing wrong. His death received virtually no media coverage. Unlike the notorious killers whose names become household words, Moore faded into obscurity. Perhaps that's fitting for a man who saw himself not as an individual seeking fame or notoriety, but as a soldier in a holy war that he believed would continue long after he was gone. But forgetting Manuel Moore would be a mistake. His story offers crucial insights into the psychology of hate crimes and domestic terrorism. It shows us how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of extraordinary evil when they surrender their individual moral judgment to extremist ideologies. Moore never became a celebrity criminal like Charles Manson or Ted Bundy. His crimes were too political, too uncomfortable, too tied to America's ongoing struggles with race and religion. But in some ways, that makes his story even more important. He represents a type of killer that we're still grappling with today. The true believer who commits murder not for personal gratification, but because he genuinely believes it's the right thing to do. The zebra murders claimed at least 15 lives and wounded 8 others, though some investigators believe the true toll was much higher. Each victim was someone's child, parent, spouse, or friend. Their deaths served no purpose other than to feed an ideology built on hatred and delusion. Manuel Moore spent the last decades of his life in a small cell, cut off from the world he had tried to change through violence. But the ideas that drove him to kill, the ability of hate to masquerade as righteousness, the ease with which ordinary people can be convinced to commit extraordinary evil, these remain as relevant today as they were in 1973. His story is a reminder that the most dangerous killers aren't always the ones who make headlines. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the believers, the ones who are absolutely certain that their cause justifies any amount of bloodshed. They walk among us, invisible until the moment they decide to act, and by then it's already too late. In a city that prides itself on love and acceptance, Manuel Moore proved that hate could flourish just as easily. His legacy isn't fame or infamy, but a chilling demonstration of how quickly civilization can crumble when people stop seeing each other as human beings deserving of life and dignity. The most terrifying thing about Manuel Moore wasn't that he was a monster. It was that he was a man, just like any other, until the day he decided that some people deserved to die simply because of the color of their skin. That capacity for evil, that ability to rationalize the unthinkable, exists in every human heart. The difference between us and him isn't biology or psychology. It's choice, and that, perhaps, is the most frightening lesson of all. On a foggy October evening in 1973, the sidewalks of San Francisco's North Beach shimmered with the faint promise of another ordinary night. Richard and Keita Haig walked hand in hand near Coit Tower, their conversation drifting into the cool air as they made their way home. They had no idea they were being watched. They had no idea that within minutes, their lives would become the opening chapter of one of the most terrifying and racially motivated killing sprees in American history. What happened to the Haigs that night wasn't random. It wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was the methodical execution of a plan born from hatred so pure, so distilled, that it would transform the streets of San Francisco into hunting grounds. The man who orchestrated their nightmare was 22 years old, soft-spoken, and utterly convinced that what he was doing was righteous. His name was Larry Craig Green, and if you've never heard of him, that's by design. Unlike the serial killers who crave fame and notoriety, Green and his accomplices preferred the shadows. They called themselves the Death Angels, and their mission was simple: kill as many white people as possible, believing each death would earn them wings in a twisted interpretation of religious doctrine. This is the story of a man who transformed from a quiet furniture mover into one of the most methodical killers in American history. It's the story of how ideology can corrupt a human soul so completely that murder becomes worship, and how a small group of true believers nearly brought an entire city to its knees. Larry Craig Green was born into a world already fractured by racial tension and social upheaval. Growing up in the Bay Area during the 1950s and early 1960s, he witnessed the civil rights movement unfold with all its promise and all its violence. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable young man. His father described him as quiet, someone who believed in doing right by whatever cause he embraced. Green graduated from Berkeley High School and briefly attended Laney and Merritt community colleges before dropping out. He lived with his wife and her 3-year-old daughter, working as a furniture mover for a company called Black Self-Help Moving and Storage. To his neighbors, he seemed like any other young man trying to make his way in the world. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something far more dangerous was taking root. It was during this period that Green encountered the Nation of Islam, a black nationalist religious movement that preached a radical interpretation of Islamic doctrine. Founded by Wallace Fard in 1930, the Nation of Islam taught that white people were devils created by an evil scientist named Yaqub, and that black people were the original inhabitants of Earth, destined to reclaim their rightful place as the chosen people of Allah. Green joined the Black Muslims, as they were commonly known, 2.5 years before the murders began. What drew him to the movement wasn't just the religious teachings, but the sense of purpose and belonging it provided. Here was an organization that didn't just acknowledge the racism and oppression he had witnessed. It provided a cosmic explanation for it, and more importantly, a solution. The Nation of Islam that Green joined wasn't the mainstream organization led by Elijah Muhammad. It was a splinter group, a radical faction that had taken the movement's teachings to their logical extreme. Where mainstream black Muslims focused on building separate black institutions and businesses, this group focused on something far more sinister: the systematic elimination of white people as a religious duty. They called themselves the Death Angels, and they operated out of the Black Self-Help Warehouse on Market Street in San Francisco. The warehouse served as both a legitimate moving company and a headquarters for what was essentially a terrorist cell. The group was small, consisting of no more than 15 active members at any given time, but their influence would far exceed their numbers. The Death Angels had developed an elaborate point system for murders. According to their twisted theology, killing white adults earned them a certain number of points, while killing white children earned even more. The ultimate goal was to accumulate enough points to earn their wings and achieve a higher status within their religious hierarchy. It was a gamification of genocide, turning mass murder into a spiritual achievement. Green quickly distinguished himself within the group. Where some members showed hesitation or doubt, Green embraced the mission completely. He didn't just participate in the killings, he helped plan them, recruit new members, and maintain the discipline necessary to keep their activities secret. His colleagues would later describe him as one of the most dedicated and ruthless members of the organization. The first attack came on October 19th, 1973, and it bore all the hallmarks of what would become the Death Angels' signature style. Richard and Keita Haig were walking near Coit Tower when a white van pulled up beside them. Green and his accomplice, Jesse Lee Cooks, forced the couple into the vehicle at gunpoint. What happened next was so brutal that even seasoned investigators would struggle to process the crime scene. The couple was driven to a secluded area where Green and Cooks carried out their ritualistic murder. Keita Haig was sexually assaulted, then nearly decapitated with a machete. The blade cut so deep that it severed her spinal cord and jugular vein, causing blood to spray across the interior of the van. Richard Haig was also attacked with the machete, but somehow survived, becoming the first witness to the Death Angels' methodology. For Green, this wasn't just murder, it was a sacrament. According to later testimony, he and Cooks gleefully recounted the details of Keita's death to other Death Angels, describing how the blood spurted from the devil's neck. The dehumanization was complete. To Green, Keita Haig wasn't a 28-year-old woman with hopes and dreams. She was merely a devil whose death brought him closer to his twisted version of paradise. The Haig attack established the pattern that would define the Death Angels' campaign of terror. They preferred to strike at night, targeting isolated victims who couldn't fight back or escape. They used both firearms and bladed weapons, often combining robbery with murder to make the crimes appear random. Most importantly, they worked in teams, providing each other with both practical support and psychological reinforcement. But what made Green particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his ability to blend back into society afterward. Within hours of nearly decapitating Keita Haig, he was back at work, moving furniture and chatting with customers as if nothing had happened. This wasn't the behavior of a man consumed by guilt or struggling with the weight of his actions. This was the behavior of someone who genuinely believed he had done something righteous. Over the next 6 months, Green and his fellow Death Angels would systematically terrorize San Francisco. They shot Paul Danzig as he stood near a telephone booth in the Haight-Ashbury district. They murdered Salim Erekat, a 53-year-old store owner, binding his hands and shooting him execution-style in his own shop. They killed Marietta DiGirolamo as she stood in a doorway on Divisadero Street, shooting her 3 times at close range. Each murder was carried out with the same methodical precision that had characterized the Hague attack. The victims were chosen not for who they were, but for what they represented, targets in a holy war that existed only in the minds of the killers. Green and his accomplices didn't know these people, had no personal grievances against them, and gained nothing material from their deaths. They killed because their twisted theology told them that killing was worship. The randomness of the attacks was what made them so terrifying. Unlike traditional serial killers who target specific types of victims or follow predictable patterns, the Death Angels struck without warning or apparent logic. A grandmother walking home from the grocery store was just as likely to be targeted as a young man standing at a bus stop. The only common denominator was the color of the victim's skin. January 28, 1974 would become known as the bloodiest day in the Death Angels campaign. On that single night, Green and his accomplices killed 4 people and paralyzed a 5th in a spree of violence that lasted just a few hours. Tana Smith was shot dead as she walked near her home. Vincent Wallen was gunned down while going through trash cans for items to repair and sell. John Bambick, an 84-year-old man, was murdered outside his apartment building. Jane Holly was killed while carrying groceries. The 5th victim, Roxanne McMillan, was a 23-year-old woman who had just moved to San Francisco with her husband and young son. She was shot twice in the back as she moved belongings into their new apartment, the bullets severing her spinal cord and leaving her paralyzed for life. To Green and his accomplices, McMillan's permanent disability was a source of particular satisfaction. They had not only killed devils that night, they had created a living reminder of their power. What made Green's participation in these crimes so chilling wasn't just the brutality, but the complete absence of remorse. While some serial killers struggle with guilt or show signs of mental illness, Green displayed none of these characteristics. He was calm, rational, and absolutely convinced that he was doing God's work. He could shoot a stranger in the back, then go home to his wife and stepdaughter as if nothing had happened. The psychological profile that emerged during Green's trial painted a picture of a man who had successfully severed all emotional connection to his victims. To him, white people weren't human beings deserving of empathy or consideration. They were obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved. This wasn't the delusion of a madman, but the calculated worldview of someone who had been systematically conditioned to see murder as a moral imperative. The Death Angels' reign of terror came to an end not through brilliant police work, but through betrayal within their own ranks. Anthony Harris, a member of the group who claimed to have participated in planning but not executing the murders, eventually contacted authorities with detailed information about the killings. Whether motivated by fear, guilt, or the promise of reward money, Harris provided investigators with the breakthrough they desperately needed. On May 1st, 1974, more than 100 heavily armed police officers simultaneously raided multiple locations throughout San Francisco. Green was arrested along with his accomplices, Manuel Moore, JCX Simon, and Jesse Lee Cooks. When police searched the Black Self-Help warehouse, they found an arsenal that read like a medieval torture chamber: machetes, axes, swords, bows and arrows, knives, and various other weapons. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the methodical way the Death Angels had documented their activities. Police found detailed notes about potential targets, maps marking the locations of previous attacks, and what appeared to be scorecards tracking the group's achievements. It was clear that these weren't impulsive acts of violence, but carefully planned operations carried out by an organized terrorist cell. During his arrest and subsequent interrogation, Green maintained the same eerie calm that had characterized his participation in the murders. He didn't deny his involvement, but he also showed no remorse for his actions. When asked about the victims and their families, he displayed the same emotional detachment that had allowed him to kill strangers without hesitation. To Green, the investigation and trial were simply the consequences of doing God's work in a world controlled by devils. The trial of the Death Angels began on March 3rd, 1975, and would become the longest criminal trial in California history at that time, lasting over a year. The prosecution, led by a team of experienced attorneys, faced the daunting task of proving that Green and his accomplices had committed crimes that seemed almost too horrific to believe. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to discredit Harris's testimony and portray their clients as victims of a racist justice system. Throughout the trial, Green maintained his composure and continued to show no signs of remorse or regret. He listened to testimony about the murders with the same detached interest he might have shown at a lecture on furniture moving techniques. When victims' family members took the stand to describe how the killings had destroyed their lives, Green showed no emotional response whatsoever. The evidence against Green was overwhelming. Harris's testimony provided detailed accounts of the planning and execution of multiple murders. Physical evidence linked the defendants to the crime scenes. Most damning of all, the systematic nature of the attacks made it clear that these weren't random acts of violence, but coordinated terrorism carried out by an organized group with a specific ideological agenda. On March 9th, 1976, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 4 defendants. Green was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, robbery, and assault with a deadly weapon. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling the crimes among the most heinous he had ever encountered. But the story of Larry Green doesn't end with his conviction. Over the decades that followed, he has become something of a case study for criminologists and psychologists trying to understand how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of extraordinary evil. Unlike many serial killers who show signs of mental illness or childhood trauma, Green appears to have been a relatively normal young man who was gradually radicalized into believing that mass murder was not only acceptable, but necessary. Prison records show that Green has remained largely unchanged by his decades of incarceration. He has rarely spoken to guards, refused most interviews with journalists and researchers, and shown no interest in rehabilitation programs. When he has appeared before parole boards, he has maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. More disturbing still, he has never expressed remorse for his victims or acknowledged the pain he caused their families. In 2024, at the age of 72, Green appeared before a parole board for what many hoped would be his final hearing. Family members of his victims traveled from across the country to attend, some carrying photographs of their murdered loved ones. Roxanne McMillan, who had been paralyzed in the 1974 attack, had died in 2022, but her son attended the hearing to read a statement she had prepared. During the hearing, Green maintained the same calm demeanor that had characterized his original trial nearly 50 years earlier. When asked about his crimes, he continued to claim innocence. When confronted with evidence of his participation in the murders, he showed no emotional response. When family members of his victims spoke about the decades of pain his actions had caused, he displayed the same cold indifference that had allowed him to kill strangers without hesitation. The parole board's decision was unanimous. Green would remain in prison for at least another 3 years. In delivering their verdict, the commissioners noted that Green continued to pose an unreasonable risk to public safety and showed no signs of rehabilitation or remorse. They pointed out that his continued denial of responsibility made it impossible to assess whether he might commit similar crimes if released. Today, Larry Green remains incarcerated at California State Prison Solano in Vacaville, the last surviving member of the Death Angels still in custody. His 3 accomplices have all died in prison: JCX Simon in 2015, Manuel Moore in 2017, and Jesse Lee Cooks in 2021. At 72 years old, Green has spent more time in prison than he did as a free man. Yet he shows no signs of acknowledging the magnitude of his crimes or the suffering he has caused. The case of Larry Green and the Death Angels represents something more disturbing than simple serial killing. It demonstrates how ideological extremism can transform ordinary people into instruments of terror, how religious doctrine can be twisted to justify the most heinous acts, and how racial hatred can metastasize into systematic violence. The Death Angels weren't mentally ill loners acting out personal fantasies. They were a coordinated group of believers who genuinely thought they were doing God's work. What makes Green's story particularly chilling is how easily he might have remained undetected. If Anthony Harris hadn't come forward, if the police hadn't connected the dots between seemingly random murders, Green and his accomplices might have continued their campaign indefinitely. They had already killed at least 15 people and wounded 8 others, and investigators believe the true number of victims may have been much higher. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Green's case is that of a man who successfully compartmentalized his life to an extraordinary degree. He could participate in the ritualistic murder of strangers, then return home to play with his stepdaughter as if nothing had happened. He could attend religious services where he was taught that killing white people was a holy act, then go to work moving furniture for those same white customers without showing any signs of internal conflict. This ability to maintain separate moral frameworks for different aspects of his life is what made Green so dangerous. He wasn't driven by uncontrollable urges or obvious mental illness. He was a rational actor operating within a belief system that had been carefully constructed to justify mass murder. He could plan attacks with the same methodical approach he brought to his job, execute them with the efficiency of someone carrying out a routine task, and return to his normal life without missing a beat. The Death Angels' campaign of terror had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate victims. The murders created a climate of fear that gripped San Francisco for months, with residents afraid to walk the streets at night and businesses reporting significant losses in revenue. The investigation led to one of the most controversial police operations in the city's history, as officers were authorized to stop and question any black man who fit the general description of the killers. The broader impact of the Death Angels' crimes can still be felt today. Their actions provided ammunition for those who sought to demonize the Nation of Islam and other black nationalist movements, making it easier to dismiss legitimate grievances about racial inequality. They also demonstrated how extremist ideologies could exploit real social problems to recruit followers and justify violence, a pattern that would be repeated by various terrorist groups in the decades that followed. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Death Angels' crimes illustrated how quickly a small group of dedicated extremists could terrorize an entire city. With fewer than 15 active members, they managed to shut down one of America's most vibrant urban centers, forcing thousands of people to change their daily routines and live in fear. It was a preview of the kind of asymmetric warfare that would become increasingly common in the years ahead. Larry Green remains in prison today, not because he has been reformed or rehabilitated, but because he continues to represent an unacceptable risk to public safety. After nearly 50 years of incarceration, he has shown no signs of remorse, no acknowledgement of his victims' humanity, and no indication that he has abandoned the ideology that motivated his crimes. In the words of one parole commissioner, he remains as dangerous a man as it is possible to find. The case of Larry Green and the Death Angels serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face. Green wasn't a wild-eyed fanatic or an obviously disturbed individual. He was a quiet young man who attended religious services, held down a job, and lived with his family. The transformation from furniture mover to terrorist wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual and methodical, the result of careful indoctrination and systematic dehumanization of his intended victims. In our current era of extremist violence and ideological terrorism, the story of Larry Green feels disturbingly contemporary. His ability to compartmentalize his beliefs, maintain a normal facade while planning acts of terror, and remain committed to his cause, despite decades of imprisonment, offers insights into the psychology of modern terrorists and mass killers. Understanding how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of extraordinary evil remains one of the most important challenges facing law enforcement and society as a whole. The victims of the Death Angels deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a crime wave, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by an ideology that denied their basic humanity. Kita Haig was a young woman who died in unimaginable terror. Paul Danzig was an art student with dreams and aspirations. Salim Erekat was a small business owner trying to make a living. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people with families who loved them and communities that needed them. Larry Green took all of that away in service of a belief system that taught him to see these people as less than human. He remains in prison today, an aging man who has spent the majority of his life behind bars, yet he has never acknowledged the magnitude of his crimes or the suffering he has caused. In his mind, he may still believe that he was doing God's work, that his victims deserved to die, and that he was a soldier in a righteous war rather than a terrorist in a campaign of senseless murder. That is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Larry Green's story. Not that he became a killer, but that he remains convinced he was right to kill. Even now, after decades of imprisonment and the deaths of all his accomplices, he maintains the same cold certainty that allowed him to participate in some of the most horrific crimes in American history. He is a reminder that some forms of evil are not crimes of passion or mental illness, but the logical conclusion of ideologies that deny the humanity of others. The name Larry Green may not be as well known as those of other serial killers, but his crimes were no less significant for their relative obscurity. He and his fellow death angels created a reign of terror that gripped one of America's greatest cities, demonstrated the deadly potential of extremist ideologies, and left scars that have never fully healed. Their story serves as a warning about the ease with which hatred can be weaponized, ordinary people can be radicalized, and entire communities can be held hostage by those who believe that murder is a form of worship. In the end, Larry Green remains exactly what he was in 1974, a man convinced that killing strangers was a holy act, that racial hatred was a religious duty, and that his victims deserved to die simply because of the color of their skin. Time, imprisonment, and the deaths of his accomplices have done nothing to change his fundamental beliefs or shake his conviction that he was right to participate in one of the most terrifying killing sprees in American history. He remains, in the words of those who have studied his case, one of the most dangerous men alive. You think you know evil. You think you've heard every story about the worst humanity has to offer. But there's a name that haunts the shadows of criminal history, a name that most people have never heard, yet one that represents some of the most terrifying acts of violence ever committed on American soil. That name is Jesse Lee Cooks. In the autumn of 1973, as San Francisco pulsed with the cultural revolution of the 70s, a different kind of revolution was brewing in the shadows. But this wasn't about peace, love, or social change. This was about something far more sinister, a twisted ideology that would transform the streets of the city by the bay into hunting grounds for human prey. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another true crime story. This is the account of a man whose descent into darkness would help unleash one of the most chilling chapters in American criminal history. A man who became part of something so evil, so methodical, that even today, nearly 50 years later, the very mention of their name sends chills down the spines of those who remember. Jesse Lee Cooks wasn't born a monster, but that's what makes his story so terrifying. Because if we dig deep enough into any of these cases, we discover that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. Instead, it creeps in quietly, taking root in the cracks of broken lives and twisted ideologies, growing until it becomes something unrecognizable and unstoppable. Cooks was part of something called the Death Angels, a splinter group within the Nation of Islam that had perverted religious teachings into a doctrine of racial murder. To earn their wings as death angels, members had to kill a specific number of white people, 4 white children, 5 white women, or 9 white men. It was evil with a scorecard, murder as a twisted rite of passage. The man we're exploring today was quiet, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who could walk past you on the street and never register in your memory. He stood about average height, with a thin build and soft-spoken demeanor that belied the darkness churning beneath the surface. Prison records would later describe him as intelligent but volatile, capable of sudden shifts from calm conversation to explosive rage. Before the killing began, Cooks had been in and out of the California prison system, where he first encountered the radical ideologies that would eventually consume him. It was behind bars that he met other future death angels, including Manuel Moore and Larry Green. It was there, in the echo chambers of San Quentin, that hatred found its voice and began to organize itself into something far more dangerous than individual rage. What made the Death Angels particularly terrifying wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their systematic approach to murder. This wasn't crime of passion or desperation. This was ideological warfare waged against innocent people whose only crime was the color of their skin. They kept detailed records, took photographs of their victims, and celebrated each death as a victory in their twisted holy war. The nightmare began on October 20th, 1973, with an act so brutal that even hardened San Francisco police officers were shaken. Richard and Quita Haig, a young married couple, were walking down the street when they were suddenly forced into a white van. What happened next defies human comprehension. Cooks and Larry Green drove the terrified couple to a remote location. Quita Haig was sexually assaulted and then hacked to death with a machete, her throat nearly severed as her attackers took turns mutilating her body. Richard was beaten unconscious, his face smashed with the same machete, left for dead in a pool of his own blood. Miraculously, he survived, though the physical and psychological scars would haunt him for the rest of his life. But for Cooks and Green, this wasn't a crime. It was a celebration. Other Death Angels members arrived at the scene with cameras, taking photographs of the blood-soaked ground as evidence of their worthiness for the organization. They smiled as they documented the carnage, treating human suffering as a trophy to be displayed. 10 days later, Cook struck again. This time, his target was Frances Rose, a 28-year-old physical therapist who had the misfortune of crossing his path. She was sitting in her car near the University of California Extension when Cooks approached her. Later testimony would reveal that he had offered her a ride, and when she allegedly responded with what he claimed was a racial slur, his rage exploded. Cooks shot Frances Rose 4 times in the head and neck at point-blank range. The violence was swift, brutal, and completely unprovoked. When police arrived at the scene, they found her slumped over the steering wheel, her life snuffed out in an instant by a man she'd never met, for reasons she could never have understood. What made Cooks particularly dangerous was his unpredictability. Unlike serial killers who follow specific patterns or target particular types of victims, he was capable of violence at any moment, against anyone who triggered his hatred. This made him nearly impossible to predict or prevent. The investigation that followed would become known as some Operation Zebra, named after the police radio frequency used to coordinate the massive manhunt. As more bodies began to pile up across San Francisco, it became clear that the city was dealing with something unprecedented, a group of killers working together, united by a common ideology of racial hatred. Between October 1973 and April 1974, the Death Angels would be linked to at least 15 murders and numerous other attacks. The victims were chosen at random. Their only shared characteristic was their race. An elderly man walking home from the grocery store, a young woman leaving work, a college student heading to class. Each became a statistic in the Death Angels' twisted accounting of racial revenge. What makes Cook's story particularly chilling is how easily he moved between his public and private personas. During the day, he worked at a Muslim bakery, serving customers with a polite smile. Co-workers described him as quiet but pleasant, the kind of employee who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. But at night, he transformed into something else entirely, a predator stalking the streets of San Francisco, looking for his next victim. The breakthrough in the case came when Anthony Harris, a fellow Death Angel who had been present at many of the murders, but hadn't participated in the actual killings, finally broke his silence. Haunted by what he had witnessed, and fearing for his own life as suspicion fell on the group, Harris contacted police and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity and the $30,000 reward that had been offered. Harris's testimony provided a horrifying glimpse into the inner workings of the Death Angels. He described how the group would meet to plan their attacks, how they celebrated each successful killing, and how they justified their actions through a perverted interpretation of religious teachings. Most disturbing of all, he revealed that the San Francisco group was just one cell in a larger network that may have been responsible for similar murders across the country. When police finally arrested Cooks in connection with the Francis Rose murder, they found him still carrying the murder weapon. His capture was almost anticlimactic. After months of terrorizing an entire city, he was taken down in a routine traffic stop just blocks from the crime scene. But even in custody, Cooks remained defiant. Unlike his co-conspirators, who maintained their innocence, he eventually confessed to his role in the murders. In cold, matter-of-fact language, he described the killings as necessary acts in a larger war against white oppression. He showed no remorse for his victims, referring to them as devils who deserved their fate. During his trial, psychiatrists attempted to understand what had driven Cooks to such extreme violence. They found a man consumed by rage, someone who had internalized years of real and perceived injustices and transformed them into a justification for murder. But there was something else, a coldness, a calculating nature that suggested his actions weren't just impulsive outbursts of anger, but deliberate choices made by someone who had convinced himself that taking human life was not only acceptable, but necessary. The trial itself became a media sensation, exposing not just the crimes of the Death Angels, but the racial tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of American society. The courtroom was packed with family members of victims, civil rights activists, and curious onlookers, all trying to understand how such hatred could have taken root in a city that prided itself on tolerance and diversity. When the verdicts came down on March 13th, 1976, Cooks was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and first-degree robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, a sentence that would keep him locked away for the next 45 years. His co-conspirators received similar sentences, effectively ending the Death Angel's reign of terror. But the story doesn't end with the convictions. For decades afterward, Cooks remained in prison, becoming something of an enigma to criminologists and psychologists who studied his case. Unlike many killers who eventually express remorse or attempt to justify their actions, Cooks largely remained silent about his crimes, offering few insights into the psychological processes that had driven him to such extreme violence. Prison records show that he was a model inmate for most of his incarceration, avoiding trouble and participating in various rehabilitation programs. To guards and fellow inmates, he appeared to have found some measure of peace, leading many to wonder if he had genuinely changed or was simply resigned to his fate. The question that haunted investigators and victims' families was always the same. What might have been prevented if someone had recognized the warning signs earlier? Cooks had a history of violence and radical beliefs, but in the early 1970s, the infrastructure for tracking and intervening with potentially dangerous individuals was primitive at best. The Death Angels were able to operate for months without detection, leaving a trail of bodies across San Francisco before anyone understood the true scope of their activities. What makes the Cooks case particularly relevant today is how it demonstrates the potential for extremist ideologies to transform individuals into instruments of violence. The Death Angels weren't born killers. They were people who had been systematically radicalized, taught to view entire groups of people as less than human, as legitimate targets for elimination. The parallels to modern forms of extremism are impossible to ignore. Whether we're talking about white supremacist violence, Islamic terrorism, or other forms of ideologically motivated killing, the basic pattern remains the same. Individuals with existing grievances are recruited by groups that provide them with a framework for channeling their anger into systematic violence against perceived enemies. Cooks died on June 30th, 2021, at the age of 76 in the hospice unit of the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He had been the only one of the Death Angels to confess to his crimes, and his death marked the end of a life that had been defined by a brief but devastating period of extreme violence. By the time of his death, San Francisco had changed dramatically. The city that had been terrorized by the Death Angels in the 1970s had become a global center of technology and innovation, home to companies that connected people across the world in ways that would have been unimaginable during the zebra murders. But for those who lived through that dark period, for the families of the victims, and for the surviving members of the community who had been forced to live in fear, the scars remained. The legacy of Jesse Lee Cooks and the Death Angels serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it grows quietly in the shadows, fed by ideology and hatred, until it explodes into violence that shatters innocent lives and changes communities forever. In the end, Cooks was just one man among many who chose to embrace an ideology of hatred over their shared humanity. But the damage he helped inflict rippled far beyond his individual actions, contributing to a climate of fear and division that took years to heal. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the power of extremist ideologies, and our collective responsibility to recognize and intervene when hatred begins to organize itself into violence. Because while we can lock away individual killers, the ideas that motivated them have a way of surviving, waiting for the next vulnerable person to come along and provide them with a new host. The name Jesse Lee Cooks may not be as well known as other serial killers, but his legacy is just as important to understand. He represents the terrifying potential for ordinary people to become instruments of extraordinary evil when they surrender their individual moral judgment to the collective hatred of extremist groups. And perhaps most disturbing of all, his story reminds us that such transformations can happen anywhere, at any time, to people who seem perfectly normal on the surface. The capacity for both good and evil exists within all of us, and the difference between the two often comes down to the choices we make and the influences we allow into our lives. In a world where extremist ideologies continue to recruit new followers and inspire acts of violence, the story of Jesse Lee Cooks serves as both a warning and a call to action. We must remain vigilant, not just against individual threats, but against the ideas and movements that create them in the first place. Because the alternative, a world where hatred is allowed to organize and act without opposition, is too terrible to contemplate. You think you know evil. You think the names that haunt the darkness are all familiar: Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. But there are predators who walked among us whose stories remain buried in the shadows of history, their names whispered only in police files and courtroom transcripts. Tonight, I want to tell you about one of them, a man whose transformation from human being to something else entirely represents one of the most chilling chapters in American criminal history. His name was JCX Simon, and if you've never heard it before, that's not because his crimes weren't horrific enough to remember. It's because the truth about what he did and why he did it is so disturbing that even decades later, most people can't bear to confront it. In the autumn of 1973, as San Francisco basked in the afterglow of the Summer of Love and America grappled with Vietnam and Watergate, a different kind of war was being declared on the streets of the city by the Bay. But this wasn't a war fought with conventional weapons or clear battle lines. This was something far more insidious, a campaign of terror waged against innocent people whose only crime was the color of their skin. JCX. Simon wasn't born a monster. That's what makes his story so terrifying, because buried somewhere in the timeline of his descent into evil is a moment when he could have chosen differently, when the trajectory of his life could have led somewhere else entirely. But understanding that moment requires us to dive deep into the darkness, to explore not just what he became, but how he got there. The man who would become one of San Francisco's most feared killers began life in a world already fractured by violence and hatred. Born into an America where the wounds of slavery were still raw and the promises of civil rights remained largely unfulfilled, Simon's early years were shaped by forces that would eventually consume him entirely. But it wasn't poverty alone that created the monster. It wasn't even racism, though that certainly played a role. What transformed JCX Simon into something inhuman was something far more dangerous: ideology twisted into a weapon, religion perverted into a justification for murder, and a system of beliefs that convinced him that killing innocent people wasn't just acceptable, but sacred. Simon's path to evil began behind the walls of San Quentin prison, where he encountered something that would change him forever: the radical teachings of a group that called itself the Death Angels. These weren't common criminals looking for easy money or thrills. These were true believers, men who had convinced themselves that murder was not only justified, but required by their faith. The Death Angels were a splinter group within the Nation of Islam, a fringe movement that had taken the legitimate anger and frustration of the black experience in America and twisted it into something unrecognizable. They preached that white people were literally devils, that killing them was not just acceptable but necessary, and that those who participated in these murders would earn their wings, a grotesque reward system that turned human slaughter into a twisted game. To earn these wings, a death angel had to kill a specific number of white victims, 4 white children, 5 white women, or 9 white men. It was evil with a scorecard, murder as a sacrament, hatred dressed up as divine purpose, and JCX Simon embraced it all with the fervor of a true believer. What made Simon particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his intelligence. Unlike many of the other death angels, who were driven more by rage than calculation, Simon approached murder with the methodical precision of a military operation. He studied his targets, planned his attacks, and executed them with a cold efficiency that left investigators baffled for months. The killing spree that would terrorize San Francisco began on October 20th, 1973, with an act so brutal that even hardened police officers struggled to comprehend it. Richard and Quita Haig, a young married couple, were taking an evening stroll near Coit Tower when they were suddenly forced into a white van by 3 men. What happened next defied human understanding. Quita was sexually assaulted and then nearly decapitated with a machete, her throat slashed so deeply that she was almost beheaded. Richard was beaten and slashed, his face mutilated beyond recognition, left for dead in a pool of his own blood. Miraculously, he survived, though the physical and psychological scars would haunt him for the rest of his life. But for Simon and his fellow death angels, this wasn't a crime. It was a celebration. They had taken the first steps toward earning their wings, and they documented their brutality with photographs, treating human suffering as a trophy to be displayed to other members of their twisted brotherhood. Over the next 6 months, the killings continued with terrifying regularity. Simon and his accomplices, Larry Green, Manuel Moore, and Jesse Lee Cooks, stalked the streets of San Francisco like hunters pursuing prey. Their victims were chosen purely for their race, random people going about their daily lives who had the misfortune of crossing paths with killers who saw them not as human beings, but as targets in a holy war. The methodology was always the same. Approach the victim, shoot them at close range with a .32 caliber pistol, and disappear into the night. No robbery, no sexual assault, no personal connection. Just execution-style murder carried out with the cold precision of an assembly line. Tana Smith, a 32-year-old woman, was shot on the sidewalk just 6 blocks from her home. Vincent Wallen, a 69-year-old man supplementing his Social Security by collecting items from trash cans, was shot twice in the back just feet from his front door where friends were waiting to celebrate his birthday. John Bambick, an 87-year-old known for his funny hats, was gunned down in broad daylight for no reason other than the color of his skin. What makes Simon's role in these murders particularly chilling is how he managed to compartmentalize his life. During the day, he worked at the Black Self-Help Moving and Storage Company, presenting himself as a productive member of society. Co-workers described him as quiet but reliable, someone who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. But at night, he transformed into something else entirely. He would meet with his fellow Death Angels to plan their next attack, studying maps of the city, identifying potential targets, and discussing the most efficient ways to kill white people. They treated murder like a business, complete with meetings, assignments, and performance reviews. The investigation that followed would become known as Operation Zebra, named after the special police radio frequency used to coordinate the massive manhunt. As more bodies piled up across San Francisco, it became clear that the city was dealing with something unprecedented, not just a serial killer, but a group of killers working together, united by a common ideology of racial hatred. The breakthrough came when Anthony Harris, a member of the Death Angels who had been present at many of the murders, but hadn't participated in the actual killings, finally broke his silence. Haunted by what he had witnessed and fearing for his own life as suspicion grew within the group, Harris contacted police and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity and a $30,000 reward. Harris's testimony provided a horrifying glimpse into the inner workings of the Death Angels. He described how Simon and the others would meet to plan their attacks, how they celebrated each successful killing, and how they justified their actions through a perverted interpretation of religious teachings. Most disturbing of all, he revealed that the San Francisco group was just one cell in a larger network that may have been responsible for similar murders across the country. When police finally moved to arrest Simon and his accomplices in May 1974, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. In addition to weapons and ammunition, they discovered photographs of the murder scenes, journals detailing the killings, and other materials that revealed the full scope of the Death Angels' activities. The trial that followed was one of the longest in California history, lasting over a year as prosecutors methodically presented evidence of the defendant's guilt. Simon, like his co-conspirators, showed no remorse for his actions. He sat in the courtroom with the same cold detachment he had displayed while stalking his victims, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but never showing any emotion when confronted with the horror he had helped unleash. When the verdicts came down in March 1976, Simon was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, a sentence that would keep him locked away for the rest of his natural life. But even behind bars, Simon remained unrepentant. Unlike some killers who eventually express remorse or attempt to rationalize their actions, he maintained his silence about the murders, offering no insights into his psychological state or explanations for his behavior. Prison records show that he was a model inmate, avoiding trouble and participating in various programs, but he never showed any genuine remorse for the lives he had taken. What makes the JCX Simon case particularly disturbing is how it demonstrates the potential for ideology to transform seemingly ordinary people into instruments of extreme violence. Simon wasn't born evil. He was made evil through a systematic process of indoctrination that taught him to view entire groups of people as less than human. The Death Angels represented something far more dangerous than common criminals motivated by greed or passion. They were true believers who had convinced themselves that murder was not only acceptable, but necessary, that killing innocent people was actually a form of religious devotion. This combination of racial hatred, religious extremism, and group dynamics created a perfect storm of violence that left 14 people dead and many more wounded. The parallels to modern forms of extremism are impossible to ignore. Whether we're talking about white supremacist violence, Islamic terrorism, or other forms of ideologically motivated killing, the basic pattern remains the same. Individuals with existing grievances are recruited by groups that provide them with a framework for channeling their anger into systematic violence against perceived enemies. Simon's story also highlights the danger of allowing legitimate grievances to be hijacked by extremist movements. The African American experience in 1970s, America included real injustices, discrimination, poverty, police brutality, and systemic racism. These were serious problems that deserved serious attention and remedies. But the Death Angels took these legitimate concerns and twisted them into a justification for murder, transforming the righteous anger of the oppressed into something monstrous. The impact of Simon's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The zebra murders, as they came to be known, terrorized an entire city and deepened racial tensions at a time when San Francisco was already struggling with issues of integration and equality. The massive police dragnet that followed the killings, which involved stopping and questioning hundreds of young black men, created its own set of civil rights concerns and further strained relations between law enforcement and the African American community. Simon died in his cell at San Quentin State Prison on March 12, 2015, at the age of 69. His death was met with little fanfare. No protests, no vigils, no lengthy obituaries exploring his life and crimes. He had spent nearly 40 years behind bars, becoming a footnote in the history of American crime, rather than the notorious figure his actions might have warranted. But his legacy lives on in the questions his case raises about the nature of evil and the potential for ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. How does someone go from being a human being to becoming something else entirely? What combination of personal grievances, ideological indoctrination, and social pressures creates a killer like JCX Simon? These are uncomfortable questions because they force us to confront the reality that the capacity for extreme violence exists within all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Simon wasn't a cartoon villain or a mythological monster. He was a real person who made a series of choices that led him down a path of unimaginable darkness. The Death Angels recruited members by offering them something that was often missing from their lives: purpose, belonging, and a sense of power. They took men who felt marginalized and powerless and gave them a mission, a cause, and a community. The fact that this mission involved murdering innocent people was presented not as a moral failing, but as a religious duty, a way of striking back at a system that had oppressed them. This process of radicalization didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, systematic, and carefully designed to break down the normal moral barriers that prevent most people from committing acts of extreme violence. Simon and his fellow Death Angels were taught to dehumanize their victims, to see them not as individuals with families, dreams, and hopes, but as representatives of an evil race that deserved to be eliminated. The photographs they took of their murder scenes weren't just trophies. They were proof of their commitment to the cause, evidence that they had overcome their human weaknesses and embraced their destiny as instruments of divine justice. Each killing made the next one easier. Each act of violence normalized the next, until murder became as routine as any other daily activity. What's perhaps most chilling about Simon's story is how normal he appeared to those around him. His co-workers at the moving company had no idea they were working alongside a killer. His neighbors saw him as just another resident of their community. Even some of his fellow Death Angels were surprised by his capacity for violence, describing him as quiet and unassuming when he wasn't participating in their murderous activities. This ability to compartmentalize, to live a double life, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It suggests that the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than we like to believe, that the difference between a productive member of society and a cold-blooded killer can sometimes be measured in ideology rather than character. The victims of Simon's crimes were denied the chance to live full lives, to achieve their dreams, to contribute to their communities. Their deaths rippled outward, affecting not just their immediate families, but entire neighborhoods, communities, and ultimately the city of San Francisco itself. The trauma of those months, when no one knew when or where the next attack might come, has never fully healed. Simon's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social bonds that hold our communities together. It reminds us that the monsters we fear aren't always hiding in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they're sitting next to us on the bus, working in the same office, living in the same neighborhood. But perhaps most importantly, his case serves as a warning about the power of extremist ideologies to transform ordinary people into instruments of terror. The Death Angels didn't recruit obvious sociopaths or clearly disturbed individuals. They targeted people who felt marginalized and angry and gave them a framework for channeling that anger into violence. In an era when extremist movements of all kinds continue to recruit new members and inspire acts of violence, the story of JCX Simon and the Death Angels remains painfully relevant. It reminds us that the fight against terrorism and extremism isn't just about catching the people who commit acts of violence. It's about understanding and addressing the conditions that make people susceptible to radicalization in the first place. Simon took his secrets with him to the grave. We'll never know what he was thinking in those final moments before he pulled the trigger, whether he ever felt any remorse for what he had done, or whether he continued to believe until the end that his actions were justified. What we do know is that his choices destroyed countless lives and left scars on a community that may never fully heal. His name may not be as well known as other serial killers, but JCX Simon's impact on American criminal history is undeniable. He was part of something larger and more terrifying than individual psychopathy. He was a soldier in an ideological war that turned murder into a sacrament and hatred into a religion. The story of JCX Simon is ultimately a story about the human capacity for both evil and redemption, about the choices we make and the consequences they have for ourselves and others. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as righteousness, justice, or divine purpose. In the end, Simon's legacy is not the twisted ideology he embraced or the innocent lives he took, but the questions his case raises about our shared humanity and our responsibility to each other. How do we prevent the next JCX Simon? How do we address legitimate grievances without allowing them to be hijacked by extremist movements? How do we maintain our faith in human nature while acknowledging its darkest possibilities? These are the questions that haunt us long after the last victim has been buried and the last killer has died in prison. They're the questions that make JCX Simon's story not just a tale of individual evil, but a mirror reflecting our own capacity for both darkness and light. In a cell at San Quentin, a man who had transformed himself into something monstrous spent his final years in silence, taking with him the answers to questions that continue to torment us. His name was JCX Simon, and his story is one we forget at our own peril. In a crumbling Florida jail cell in July 1974, a man sat alone with nothing but a paperclip. The guards thought he was just another petty criminal, locked up for stabbing a bartender in a bar fight. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most dangerous predators America had ever produced. His name was Paul John Nolles, and in just 4 months, he would become one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history. But unlike the household names we know today, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, Nolles would slip into obscurity, his reign of terror almost forgotten. Almost. The paperclip wasn't just a piece of office supply to Nolles, it was a key. Within hours, he had picked the lock on his cell door and vanished into the Florida night. What followed was a cross-country killing spree, so brutal and so random that investigators called him pure evil. They called him the Casanova Killer, but there was nothing romantic about what he did. In the span of 120 days, this charming, handsome drifter would claim at least 18 lives across 7 states, leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched from Florida to Nevada. But to understand the monster Paul Nolles became, you have to start with the broken child he once was. Paul John Nolles was born on April the 25th, 1946, in Orlando, Florida, to Thomas Jefferson Nolles and Bonnie Strickland. From the very beginning, his life was marked by abandonment and instability. His father, unable or unwilling to handle the responsibility of raising a child, gave him up when Paul was still young, sending him to bounce between foster homes and reformatories like a piece of unwanted luggage. The foster care system in 1950s Florida was brutal. Children were seen as burdens, not people. They were fed, housed, and forgotten. Paul learned early that kindness was rare, that trust was dangerous, and that survival meant taking what you needed before someone took it from you. By age 8, he was already stealing. By his teens, he was breaking into houses, not just for money, but for the thrill of violating someone else's safe space. At 19, Nolles crossed a line that would define the rest of his short life. During a routine traffic stop in Jacksonville, Florida, something inside him snapped. Instead of cooperating with the police officer, Nolles pulled out a gun, kidnapped the patrolman, and held him hostage for hours before eventually releasing him unharmed. It was his first taste of real power, the first time he held someone's life completely in his hands. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison for kidnapping a police officer. Prison didn't rehabilitate Paul Nolles. It educated him. He learned how to pick locks, how to read people, how to manipulate and charm his way into getting what he wanted. He spent the next several years cycling in and out of jail on various charges: burglary, auto theft, assault. But each time he was released, he came out more hardened, more calculating, and more dangerous. In early 1974, while serving time at Rayford Prison in Florida, Nolles began corresponding with a woman named Angela Kovic, a divorcee living in San Francisco. Their relationship was conducted entirely through letters at first, but something about Nolles's words captivated her. He was articulate, charming, and somehow managed to convince her that he was a man worth saving. When she finally visited him in prison, Nolles proposed marriage on the spot. Incredibly, she said yes. Kovic was so smitten with this handsome stranger behind bars that she paid for his legal counsel, spending her own money to help secure his release. In May 1974, Nolles walked out of Rayford Prison a free man and immediately flew to San Francisco to marry the woman who had saved him. But freedom and love weren't enough for Paul Nolles. They never would be. When Nolles arrived in California, something had changed. Angela Kovic, who had fallen in love with the man in her letters, was confronted with the reality of Paul Nolles in person. Later, she would describe feeling an aura of fear around him that terrified her. A psychic had warned her about the entry of a dangerous new man in her life, and standing face to face with Nolles, she finally understood what that meant. Days before their planned wedding, Kovic called off the engagement. For most people, heartbreak is painful but survivable. For Paul Nolles, it was the final spark that ignited a bomb that had been building his entire life. According to his own claims, he went out that very night and killed 3 random people on the streets of San Francisco, though these murders were never verified. What is certain is that something fundamental shifted in Nolles that night. The last thread connecting him to humanity had snapped. Devastated and enraged, Nolles returned to Jacksonville, Florida, where his violent tendencies quickly surfaced again. He was arrested after stabbing a bartender during a fight, but this time, incarceration wouldn't hold him. On the night of July 26th, 1974, using that paperclip he'd pocketed, Nolles picked the lock on his detention cell and escaped into the darkness. His 4-month reign of terror had begun. The same night he escaped, Nolles broke into the home of 65-year-old Alice Henrietta Curtis in Jacksonville. Alice was a quiet, elderly woman who lived alone, the kind of person who still trusted that locking her doors would keep her safe. Nolles bound and gagged her, ransacked her house for money and valuables, then stole her car. Alice Curtis choked to death on the gag, becoming the first confirmed victim of what would become one of America's most brutal killing sprees. But Nolles wasn't finished in Jacksonville. For several days, he drove around in Alice Curtis's stolen car, and it was during this time that he encountered 2 young girls, 11-year-old Lillian Anderson and her 7-year-old sister Mylette. The girls recognized him as a friend of his mother's, and Nolles, paranoid that they would identify him to police, made a chilling decision. He kidnapped both children, strangled them, and dumped their bodies in a swamp outside of town. The Anderson sisters were never found, and while Nolles later confessed to their murders, investigators believe this may have been one of his false confessions designed to inflate his reputation. What made Paul Nolles so terrifying wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his complete unpredictability. Unlike most serial killers who follow patterns, target specific types of victims, or operate in familiar territories, Nolles killed anyone, anywhere, for any reason or no reason at all. His victims ranged in age from 7 to 65. They were men, women, and children. They were wealthy and poor, urban and rural, strangers and acquaintances. The only thing they had in common was that they crossed paths with Paul Nolles at the wrong moment. Moving north from Florida, Nolles strangled 49-year-old Marjorie Howe in Atlantic Beach, leaving her apartment with nothing but her television set. He killed 24-year-old Kathy Sue Pierce in Muzella, Georgia, strangling the young mother in her own home, but leaving her 3-year-old son unharmed. A random act of mercy that made no sense given the brutality of everything else he did. In September 1974, Nolles met 32-year-old William Bates at Scott's Inn, a roadside bar near Lima, Ohio. Witnesses remembered seeing Bates leave with a young red-headed man who seemed friendly and charming. Bates's nude body was found weeks later in the woods, strangled and discarded like garbage. Nolles had stolen his car and was already hundreds of miles away, moving across the country like a deadly storm. What distinguished Nolles from other killers was his mobility and his complete lack of a signature. He drove stolen cars from state to state, switching vehicles whenever one became too hot. He used different methods to kill: strangulation, shooting, stabbing, beating. He targeted victims of opportunity, people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This made him almost impossible to track, as law enforcement agencies across multiple states had no idea they were dealing with the same killer. In Nevada, Nolles bound and shot 2 elderly campers, 62-year-old Emmett Johnson and 59-year-old Lois Johnson, at a rest stop near Ely. The couple had been enjoying their retirement, traveling the country in their RV, when they encountered pure evil in human form. Nolles killed them both execution style and stole their credit cards, using them to fund his continued rampage across the country. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Paul Nolles was his craving for attention and fame. Unlike killers who try to hide their crimes, Nolles wanted the world to know what he had done. During his killing spree, he began recording detailed audio confessions describing his murders, which he mailed to a Florida attorney. On these tapes, he spoke with chilling clarity about his victims, describing how he chose them, how he killed them, and how it made him feel. He wanted a book written about his crimes, a movie made about his life, with the proceeds split between himself and his mother. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be famous for it. One of the most bizarre chapters in Nolles' story occurred in November 1974, when he met British journalist Sandy Fox at a Holiday Inn bar in Atlanta. Fox later described being immediately struck by his looks, saying he was a cross between Robert Redford and Ryan O'Neal. She spent several days with Nolles, even sleeping with him, completely unaware that she was in the company of one of America's most wanted killers. Nolles, for his part, seemed to enjoy the game of hiding in plain sight. But there was something wrong with him even then. Fox later reported that he was unable to perform sexually during their encounters, suggesting a deeper psychological dysfunction. They parted ways on November 10th, with Fox having no idea how close she had come to becoming another victim. The next day, however, Nolles picked up Susan Mackenzie, one of Fox's friends, and demanded sex at gunpoint. Mackenzie managed to escape and immediately contacted police, setting in motion the events that would finally bring Nolles down. But even as law enforcement closed in, Nolles couldn't stop killing. On November 6th, 1974, in Milledgeville, Georgia, he befriended 45-year-old Carswell Hall Carr Sr. and was invited to spend the night at Carr's home. That night, Nolles stabbed Carr to death and then strangled Carr's 15-year-old daughter, Amanda Beth Carr. In perhaps his most depraved act, he then attempted necrophilia with the teenager's corpse, a level of evil that shocked even hardened investigators. 2 weeks later, on November 16th, 1974, Paul Nolles committed what would be his final murders. He had taken Florida State Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell and Delaware businessman James Meyer hostage, handcuffing both men to a tree in a remote wooded area in Pulaski County, Georgia. Then, with the same cold calculation he had shown throughout his spree, he shot each man in the head at close range. But this time, Nolles had finally pushed his luck too far. As he tried to escape in a stolen vehicle, he ran into a police roadblock in Henry County, Georgia. What followed was a high-speed chase that ended when Nolles crashed his car and fled on foot into the woods. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions, along with tracking dogs and helicopters, launched a massive manhunt. On November 17th, in 1974, Paul Nolles was finally cornered, not by trained police officers, but by a civilian. David Clark, a 27-year-old Vietnam War veteran and hospital maintenance worker, was out hunting when he spotted Nolles emerging from the woods. Clark held the killer at gunpoint with his shotgun until law enforcement arrived to make the arrest. In custody, Nolles was surprisingly talkative. He confessed to murdering 35 people, though investigators could only verify 18 deaths. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the interviews, the chance to explain his twisted philosophy to anyone who would listen. He spoke about his crimes with no remorse, no emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. But Paul Nolles would never stand trial for his crimes. On December the 18th, 1974, he was being transported by Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee and Georgia Bureau of Investigation Agent Ronnie Angel to Henry County, where he had told authorities he had hidden the gun he used to murder Trooper Campbell. During the drive, Nolles used a paperclip, the same tool that had started his spree, to pick the locks on his handcuffs. In the back seat of the police car, Nolles lunged for Sheriff Lee's revolver. Agent Angel, sitting in the front passenger seat, turned and fired 3 shots into Knowles' chest. Paul John Nolles died instantly on Interstate 20, just outside of Douglasville, Georgia. He was 28 years old. The audio tapes that Nolles had recorded, the detailed confessions that might have provided answers about his other victims, were never released to the public. Years later, they were reportedly destroyed in a flood at the federal courthouse in Macon, Georgia, taking with them the only first-hand account of one of America's most brutal killing sprees. Today, Paul John Nolles remains one of the lesser-known serial killers in American history, overshadowed by more famous names like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. But investigators who worked his case say he was more dangerous than any of them. I think he was more vicious than Bundy was, retired investigating officer James Josie told reporters years later. When you think of Paul John Nolles, I just think of pure evil. Unlike other killers who targeted specific types of victims or operated in familiar territory, Nolles killed indiscriminately across multiple states. He had no cooling-off periods, no complex rituals, no deep psychological need that his murders fulfilled. He killed because he wanted to, because he could, and because it made him feel powerful. The story of Paul John Nolles is a reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs or grand announcements. Sometimes it's charming, handsome, and articulate. Sometimes it buys you drinks at a bar and makes you laugh. Sometimes it helps elderly campers set up their tent before shooting them in the head. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who look nothing like the monsters we imagine. In 4 months, Paul Nolles traveled across 7 states, leaving behind at least 18 confirmed victims and possibly many more. He was captured not by sophisticated police work or advanced forensics, but by a veteran with a hunting rifle who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And he died as he had lived, violently, suddenly, and without explanation. The families of his victims never got the closure they deserved. Many of his crimes remain unsolved, his confessions lost forever. But the impact of his brief, brutal rampage continues to echo through the communities he terrorized, a reminder that some monsters are real and some of them walk among us with a smile. In the sterile halls of Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, patients and their families found comfort in a gentle-faced orderly with soft brown eyes and an easy smile. Donald Harvey was the kind of healthcare worker you'd want caring for your loved ones during their most vulnerable moments. He was attentive, compassionate, always present when patients needed him most. In fact, he seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to be at the bedside when someone was about to pass away. His colleagues nicknamed him the Angel of Death, and they meant it as a compliment. They had no idea how right they were. Between 1970 and 1987, this unassuming man with the cherubic face and quiet demeanor systematically murdered at least 37 people, though he claimed the number was 37, closer to 87. Unlike the flashy killers we know by name, Harvey operated in plain sight, his crimes hidden behind the natural expectation of death in hospital settings. He didn't hunt in dark alleys or abandoned warehouses. His hunting ground was where people went to heal, where families trusted strangers with their most precious possessions, their loved ones' lives. But Donald Harvey wasn't healing anyone. He was playing God, deciding who lived and who died with the casual indifference of someone choosing what to have for lunch. And for 17 years, nobody suspected that the helpful orderly who always seemed to be around when death came calling was actually the one summoning it. Donald Harvey was born on April 15th, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, but his family soon moved to the tiny Appalachian town of Boonville, Kentucky, where his parents Ray and Goldie Harvey struggled as tobacco farmers. From the outside, Donald appeared to have a normal childhood in this tight-knit Baptist community. His elementary school principal would later describe him as a very special child who was always clean and well-dressed, with big brown eyes and dark curly hair, and always had a smile. But beneath this idealized surface, something dark was festering. When Donald was just 6 months old, his father fell asleep while holding him and accidentally dropped him on his head. The injury didn't seem serious at the time, but Donald's soft spot never properly closed. At age 5, he fell off the side of a truck, suffering another head injury that left a large wound on the back of his skull. Whether these early traumas played a role in what he would become is unclear, but they marked the beginning of a childhood that would be defined by pain and violation. Between the ages of 4 and 18, Donald Harvey was sexually molested and raped by at least 3 different men, including his uncle Wayne during visits to his grandmother's house, and an older neighbor who offered him money for sexual favors. For over a decade, young Donald endured systematic abuse, telling no one except his sister, and only after it had ended. The shy, quiet boy who had once been described as sociable gradually withdrew into himself, becoming a loner who found solace only in books and dreams of escape. Despite earning A's and B's with little effort, Harvey grew bored with high school and dropped out in the 9th grade. He eventually earned his GED through correspondence school, but by then he was already adrift, unsure of what to do with his life. In 1970, he moved to Cincinnati and got a job at a factory, but when work slowed and he was laid off, his mother called with a suggestion that would change everything. His grandfather was ill and had been placed in Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Would Donald go visit him? None of them could have known that this simple family request would unleash one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. At Marymount Hospital, 18-year-old Donald Harvey found his calling. He applied for a job as an orderly and was hired with minimal vetting, a practice common at the time for lower-level hospital positions. Suddenly, this young man who had spent his entire life feeling powerless found himself in a position of ultimate control. He had access to vulnerable patients, medical equipment, and most importantly, the trust of people who couldn't defend themselves. On May 30th, 1970, Harvey committed his first murder. His victim was 88-year-old Logan Evans, an incontinent stroke patient who had smeared feces on Harvey during care. In a rage, Harvey took a plastic sheet and a pillow and smothered the old man until he stopped breathing. Then, as if nothing had happened, Harvey cleaned up the body and calmly notified the nurse on duty that Mr. Evans had passed away. The next day, Harvey killed again. This time, it was James Tyree, whom Harvey murdered by deliberately inserting the wrong size catheter and then holding him down until he vomited blood and died. 2 murders in 2 days, and no one suspected a thing. For Harvey, it was intoxicating. The power over life and death, the ability to end suffering with a simple action, the complete control over another human being's fate. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. But Harvey was smart enough to pace himself. He understood that too many deaths too quickly would draw attention, so he developed what he would later call his mercy killings. He told himself he was ending the suffering of terminal patients, putting them out of their misery like a compassionate veterinarian with a dying animal. His third victim, 42-year-old Elizabeth Wyatt, fit this narrative perfectly. Harvey claimed she had asked him to help her die, that she was in tremendous pain and wanted release. So he cut off her oxygen supply and watched her slip away. Over the course of 10 months at Marymount Hospital, Harvey killed at least 10 more patients. He suffocated some with pillows, others he connected to faulty oxygen tanks that slowly starved them of air. In one particularly grotesque case, he killed 81-year-old Ben Gilbert by puncturing his bladder with a coat hanger that he shoved through the man's catheter, causing internal bleeding and a slow, agonizing death. The beauty of Harvey's method was its invisibility. In a hospital setting, death was expected. Elderly patients, chronically ill patients, patients in intensive care, they died regularly, and rarely did anyone question the cause too closely. Harvey was exploiting the one environment where murder could hide in plain sight, where his victims' advanced age and poor health provided perfect cover for his crimes. But Harvey's first spree came to an abrupt end in March 1971, when he was arrested for breaking into a neighbor's apartment and stealing coins, clothes, and jewelry. He also set a small fire in the apartment, though he wasn't charged with arson. Harvey pleaded guilty to petty theft, paid a $50 fine, and was referred to a mental health center for counseling. During his arrest, intoxicated and rambling, he actually babbled about his killings to police, but the authorities dismissed his claims as the nonsensical ravings of a drunk. If they had listened, if they had investigated, the nightmare that was about to unfold across multiple states over the next 16 years, might never have happened. Instead, Harvey attended a few counseling sessions and then left town. He briefly enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, but was discharged after 9 months when officials learned of his criminal record. For the next several years, he drifted between jobs and cities, working as a telephone operator, hospital clerk, and various other positions. But the hunger was still there, the need for control, the intoxicating power that came with deciding who lived and who died. In the late 1970s, Harvey found his way back to healthcare, this time at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center. Here, he resumed his deadly work, but with more sophistication. He had learned from his earlier experiences and now understood how to kill without detection. He also expanded his methods, becoming proficient with a variety of poisons and drugs that were readily available in a hospital setting. Harvey's preferred weapons became cyanide and arsenic, which he administered through food, drinks, or direct injection. Cyanide was particularly appealing to him because it was difficult to detect and mimicked the symptoms of heart failure, perfect for elderly patients who might be expected to die from cardiac problems. He also used insulin to send diabetic patients into fatal comas, morphine and codeine overdoses that looked like accidental medication errors, and even petroleum-based cleansers that he mixed into patients' food or injected directly into their IV lines. But Harvey's killing wasn't limited to patients. During this period, he began targeting people in his personal life as well. He killed roommates who annoyed him, neighbors who crossed him, and even the family members of his lovers. In one particularly twisted case, he slowly poisoned his live-in boyfriend, Carl Hoover, with small, non-lethal doses of arsenic whenever Harvey suspected him of cheating. The idea wasn't to kill Carl, but to make him too sick to leave the house. When Carl's father Henry became suspicious of Harvey, he was murdered with a lethal dose of arsenic. Harvey also killed 2 of his neighbors, Helen Metzger, whom he poisoned by putting arsenic in her pie, and Edward Wilson, whom he murdered with arsenic after Wilson tried to protect Carl from Harvey's abuse. In 1985, Harvey's career at the VA hospital came to an end when security guards discovered a loaded .38 caliber revolver, stolen hospital supplies, and books on the occult in his gym bag. The hospital couldn't discipline him because security had no probable cause for the search, so Harvey was allowed to quietly resign from his position as an autopsy assistant. By this point, he had been stealing body parts from corpses for use in occult rituals, adding a disturbing supernatural element to his already twisted psychology. In February 1986, Harvey took a position at Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, where he would commit his most prolific period of killing. Over the next 13 months, Harvey murdered 23 patients using an increasingly sophisticated arsenal of methods. He disconnected life support machines, injected air into patients' veins, suffocated them with pillows, and administered a cocktail of poisons, including arsenic, cyanide, rat poison, and petroleum-based cleansers. His colleagues at Drake noticed the unusual number of deaths occurring on Harvey's shifts, but rather than raising alarms, they treated it as a running joke. They called him the Angel of Death and the Kiss of Death, teasing him about his presence whenever someone died. Harvey played along, often saying things like, "Well, I took care of another one for you," or "I got another one today." Everyone laughed, thinking it was just dark hospital humor. None of them realized that Harvey was literally confessing to murder right in front of them. The nurses who worked most closely with Harvey began to notice patterns that troubled them. Patients who had been stable or even improving would suddenly take a turn for the worse during Harvey's shifts. Several nurses filed complaints with hospital administrators, expressing concern about the spike in deaths when Harvey was on duty. But instead of investigating, the administrators ordered the nurses to keep quiet, apparently more concerned about the hospital's reputation than patient safety. Harvey was careful to target patients who wouldn't be missed or whose deaths wouldn't raise suspicions. He worked primarily in areas of the hospital where patients were expected to have poor outcomes: intensive care units, cardiac care, areas where elderly and terminally ill patients were housed. He also chose victims strategically, focusing on patients whose families weren't present or weren't asking difficult questions about their loved ones' care. But Harvey's systematic approach to murder went beyond just choosing the right victims. He had also developed an almost scientific understanding of how different poisons and methods would affect the human body. He knew exactly how much cyanide to use to mimic a heart attack, how much insulin would send a diabetic into a fatal coma, and how to disconnect life support equipment in ways that would look like mechanical failure rather than sabotage. For Harvey, killing had become routine, almost mundane. He later described the process in chillingly casual terms, explaining that he felt no emotion when taking someone's life. It was simply something he did, like taking out the trash or cleaning a room. He had completely disconnected from the humanity of his victims, viewing them not as people with families and dreams and fears, but as problems to be solved or annoyances to be eliminated. The end came suddenly, triggered by what should have been a routine autopsy. On March 7th, 1987, Harvey killed 2 patients in a single day. One was 82-year-old Hilda Lights, whom he murdered by feeding her detachable cleaning fluid through her gastric tube and in her orange juice. The other was 44-year-old John Powell, a motorcycle accident victim who had been comatose for months but was showing signs of recovery. Powell's murder would prove to be Harvey's downfall. Unlike Harvey's typical elderly victims, Powell was relatively young and had been getting better. His sudden death seemed suspicious enough to warrant a careful autopsy. When Dr. Lee Lehman opened Powell's stomach cavity, he immediately smelled the distinctive odor of bitter almonds, the telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Dr. Lehman had performed hundreds of autopsies and was familiar with the smell of cyanide from his laboratory work. He knew immediately that he was looking at a homicide. Samples were sent to 3 different laboratories to confirm the presence of lethal levels of cyanide, and Cincinnati police were notified. When detectives began investigating, Harvey's name quickly came to their attention. They learned about his suspicious departure from the VA hospital and the disturbing pattern of deaths that seemed to follow him wherever he worked. Harvey initially agreed to take a polygraph test, even going so far as to buy a book on how to beat lie detector tests, but then called in sick on the day of the exam. When police brought Harvey in for questioning, he surprised everyone by confessing almost immediately. But his confession was limited. He admitted to killing John Powell with cyanide, claiming he felt sorry for the man and wanted to end his suffering, but he denied ever having killed anyone else. That might have been the end of it. 1 murder, 1 conviction, 1 life sentence. But local news anchor Pat Minarton wasn't satisfied. During his report on Harvey's arrest, Menarson asked on air whether this hospital orderly, who had spent nearly 2 decades in healthcare, might be responsible for other deaths. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Anonymous tips poured into the television station from nurses and hospital staff who had worked with Harvey over the years. They described a pattern of suspicious deaths, filed complaints that had been ignored, and observations that had been dismissed by administrators. Armed with this information, Menarson began investigating Harvey's background and quickly discovered evidence linking him to dozens of other murders. When Menarson contacted Harvey's court-appointed attorney, William Whalen, and shared his findings, Whalen was initially skeptical, but when he confronted Harvey directly, asking if he had killed anyone else, Harvey's response was simple: yes. Faced with the prospect of overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a death sentence, Whalen negotiated a plea bargain. In exchange for Harvey's full confession to all of his murders, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. What followed was a marathon session in which Harvey confessed to killing 24 people, describing his methods and motivations in chilling detail. On August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 counts of first-degree murder in Ohio. In accordance with the plea agreement, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. But the investigation wasn't over. Authorities in Kentucky had also been examining suspicious deaths at Marymount Hospital, and Harvey was ultimately charged and convicted of additional murders there as well. In total, Harvey was officially convicted of 37 murders, but he claimed the actual number was much higher, possibly as many as 87 victims. The true extent of his crimes may never be known, as so many deaths had been attributed to natural causes, and the bodies had long since been buried or cremated. What made Harvey particularly terrifying wasn't just the number of people he killed, but the casual, methodical way he went about it. Unlike other serial killers who were driven by sexual sadism, rage, or psychological compulsion, Harvey seemed to kill simply because he could. He described no emotional highs from the murders, no sexual gratification, no sense of completing some cosmic mission. For him, murder was just another tool for exercising control over his environment. During his trial and subsequent interviews, Harvey showed no remorse for his actions. When prosecutors displayed a list of his victims' names in court, he reportedly chuckled. He maintained his belief that many of his killings were acts of mercy, telling interviewers, "I felt what I was doing was right. I was putting people out of their misery." But when pressed about the murders of healthy patients, family members, and neighbors, he simply said, "After I didn't get caught for the first 15, I thought it was my right." Harvey also revealed the deeply twisted relationship he had developed with death itself. He spoke about the sense of power that came from deciding when someone would die, the control he felt over the timing and method of their passing. He described watching patients' families grieve and feeling no emotion whatsoever, as if he were observing the behavior of insects rather than witnessing human suffering. Perhaps most disturbing was Harvey's matter-of-fact approach to discussing his crimes. He provided detailed explanations of his methods, offered suggestions for how hospitals could prevent future killings, and even seemed to take pride in having evaded detection for so long. To him, the murders weren't aberrant behavior requiring explanation. They were simply part of who he was. For the families of Harvey's victims, his confessions brought a mixture of closure and renewed anguish. Many had spent years wondering why their loved ones had died so suddenly or suffered unexpected complications. Learning that their deaths had been deliberate murders perpetrated by someone they had trusted to provide care added an extra layer of trauma to their grief. The Harvey case also exposed serious flaws in hospital oversight and background checking procedures. The fact that he had been able to move between multiple healthcare facilities, often after being forced to resign under suspicious circumstances, highlighted the lack of communication between institutions and the inadequate vetting of employees who had access to vulnerable patients. On March 30th, 2017, Donald Harvey's own life came to a violent end. After serving 30 years in prison, the 64-year-old was found beaten in his cell at Toledo Correctional Institution. He died 2 days later from his injuries, killed by a fellow inmate named James Elliott. Prison officials never revealed the motive for the attack, but it was noted that Harvey died in much the same way as many of his victims, helplessly, at the hands of someone who had power over him. Harvey's death brought to a close one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American serial killing. Unlike the household names who dominated headlines and inspired countless books and movies, Harvey had operated in relative obscurity, his crimes hidden by the institutional blindness of the healthcare system and the natural expectation of death in hospital settings. But his impact was far more profound than that of many more famous killers. He didn't just take lives, he violated the fundamental trust between patients and caregivers, between the vulnerable and those sworn to protect them. He turned places of healing into hunting grounds, transformed acts of mercy into instruments of murder. The story of Donald Harvey serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears scrubs and carries a stethoscope. Sometimes it speaks in gentle tones and offers comfort to the dying. Sometimes the person you trust most to care for you in your darkest hour is the one who will ensure you never see the light again. Harvey claimed to have killed 87 people over the course of 17 years, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But his true legacy isn't in the numbers. It's in the realization that monsters can hide in the most unlikely places, behind the most trusted faces, in the very institutions we depend on to keep us safe. In his final interview before his death, Harvey was asked if he had any regrets. His response was as chilling as anything he had ever said. "I wouldn't do it again, but we all have some regrets." Even at the end, even after decades in prison, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the full horror of what he had done. To Donald Harvey, the deaths of 87 innocent people were just regrets, mistakes to be learned from, not crimes to be mourned. The angel of death had finally met his own angel, but there was no mercy in his passing, no gentle easing of suffering. There was only the same brutal violence that he had inflicted on so many others, a fitting end to a life that had been dedicated to the casual, methodical destruction of human hope and trust. Today, the hospitals where Harvey worked have long since implemented new security measures and background check procedures. But the victims he claimed remain gone forever, their lives cut short by a man who saw murder not as a crime, but as a privilege. And somewhere in the sterile halls of other hospitals, in other cities, other potential Donald Harveys may be walking among us, wearing the same gentle smile, offering the same false comfort, waiting for their moment to play God with the lives of those who trust them most.